What are the Pioneer decks that you need to be prepared for? Well, I've got the list right here. Everyone, this is Nikachu, Merfolk Master, and with Pioneer super on the rise, people are wondering, what the hell do I have to prepare for? What is even out there? What are the main decks now that all the bannings have been done with? What is settled? What are the most important things that you should watch out for? And that is what we're going to talk about today. The top 10! The top 10 decks ranked in order of importance that you want to watch out for in Pioneer. Now we've got some honorable mentions because there's like a lot of other decks out there. So honorable mention decks, we've got Lotus Field. This deck is super fringe right now, but you might randomly play against it. Would not try too hard to prepare for it. Hardened Scales. Hardened Scales was a really big thing when Pioneer started, but it's like completely fallen off the map in terms of like competitive results. I don't want to say anything bad about the archetype. It's just like it's not pulling any results anymore. Marvel doing really poorly. Something around Mono Blue Devotion / Wizards. I gotta prove to everybody that this deck is the hot thing, but right now it's super fringe. I wouldn't expect it. And also Dredge, the graveyard-oriented prized amalgam sort of decks. Not many people running these things yet. But anyway, so those aren't the really big things you should be. Those things aren't worth preparing for entirely. But so let's start off with number 10, Rock. Of course, anyone who's a Black-Green X player who like to play with Tarmogoyfs in Modern, they're going to find some way to make this thing playable in Pioneer. And you know what? They got like basically everything. Look, they got Abrupt Decay, they got Assassin's Trophy, they've got Scavenging Ooze, they've got Fatal Push, they have Grimflayer, which is basically their new Tarmogoyf. So they can do a pretty good impression of like a Jund-like deck. But so they got Rock. Rock is entirely an archetype. It's running around at number 10 because, you know, it's not one of the most impressive, strongest decks out there, but they've got game. They've got Liliana the Last Hope and that Swift End creature, instant speed, destroy target creature or planeswalker, and also it's a lifelink creature in itself. So not too bad. A lot of game with that deck. The Thoughtseize still good. Thoughtseize still good in Pioneer. So moving up to number 9. And maybe I'm giving this deck a little bit too much credit, but Soulflayer. I think Soulflayer is seeing an increased amount of play. I think this is one of these decks that are going to be on the rise, and also I think it's the type of deck that a lot of people would be very interested in running. So if you don't know what Soulflayer is, it's a black 4 generic, but it's got Delve, and if for every creature that you delve away, you gain its abilities. Most specifically, it says specifically what abilities it's allowed to absorb, but it's things like haste, first strike, double strike, trample, flying, those sort of keywords, those common keywords that we see on a lot of creatures. So you can end up making, if you delve away 4 creatures and they have like double strike and lifelink and flying and vigilance, then you can have this 4/4 vigilance, double strike, flying, lifelink creature in play with hexproof that you can't deal with. But so they mill stuff in the graveyard and they delve this thing in play. I think it's something to watch out for. Not a big player yet, but it's on the rise. So moving up to number 8 is Spirits, blue-white Spirits. Sometimes with a green splash. Sometimes they'll do that. But basically blue-white Spirits. Spirits basically has everything. All the common cards that you would think from Spirits, from Mausoleum Wanderer to Rattlechains to Selfless Spirit to Spell Queller, and they got more lords with that Eagle, something Eagle. All flying creatures get +1/+1. And all the spirits fly, so who cares? That's basically what they're looking for. So they've got all the tools that they want in their Spirits deck. And the Spirits deck, I think, is the only deck that can perfectly utilize, or best utilize, Curious Obsession. Now, a lot of people are trying to make use out of Curious Obsession in Pioneer, and most to a complete disaster. Because, like, if you play Curious Obsession, draw a card, and your opponent kills that creature, like, who cares? You didn't actually get good value. You need to draw at least one more card off the Curious Obsession to make it worth it. Otherwise, you wasted resources, you wasted time, it's a complete waste of everything. I think spirits can take best use out of Curious Obsession because of, what's it called? You can try to protect it with Mausoleum Wanderer, you can try to protect it with Rattle Chains, you can try to protect with Selfless Spirit, you can try to protect with Spell Queller. So there's a lot of ways of protecting your creature with the Curious Obsession on it. And I believe Spirits probably needs to get some more results, but I think it's a real player in Pioneer, and it's actually one of the decks that I very strongly am leaning towards. If I can't make, personally, my Wizards deck work, I would move to Blue-White Spirits personally. It would fit my playstyle and is probably the tribal deck going forward in Pioneer. Coming in at number 7, Gruul Aggro. So it's very a simple deck. It's like mono green aggro, but it's splashing red for stuff like Glorybringer, for example. So you've got your Llanowar Elf, your Elvish Mystic starts, really impressive starts in Pioneer. Some people think these cards should be banned. I don't think so, but then you can ramp into turn 2 Lovestruck Beast, 5/5 creatures, pretty impressive, but you can go into your top end with Glorybringer and other sort of cards like that. You really go over the top of your opponent. So Gruul Aggro is basically mono green aggro, but they opt to play with red instead. So moving up to number 6, Izzet Phoenix. Now, older versions of the deck will be playing with Thing in the Ice. The new hotness is Young Pyromancer. Young Pyromancer is seeing play again. It's almost like Delver, except there's no Delver. It's an Arc-like Phoenix. I mean, might as well be Delver. Delver's back in the form of a flying red-hot bird. The turkey is flown. Anyway, so, I mean, it's same body, right? 3/2 flyer with haste. But anyway, the Izzet Phoenix deck, it is around, it's still doing pretty well. They've innovated away from Thing in the Ice for Young Pyromancer. They believe that that is a much better card in this metagame. You can get a bunch of value off of Young Pyromancer before it dies. You know, you can work hard to try to flip your Thing in the Ice, but if they Fatal Push it, not too good, not too impressive. And not to mention, you know, things like Chandra Torch of Defiance. Is that the one that can shoot a 4 toughness creature? But anyway, Thing in the Ice moving down in playability. Young Pyromancer moving up by a lot. Izzet Phoenix is a deck to be expecting. Has a lot of longevity. I mean, that deck can grind really well. They play with things like Dig Through Time. Do not underestimate those cards. And Treasure Cruise, or I don't know. All those builds are a blur in my head. So we're done with all the tier 2-ish decks. Let's move into what's tier 1. Now these are the big decks you have to be prepared for, because if you're not, you're going to get crushed by them. You better have a good plan, and you better expect them if you intend on winning any sort of Pioneer tournament. In number 5, Green Ramp. Now this is basically like, if you know Titan Shift from Modern, it's basically this, except there's like, the payoffs are like Ulamog and Ugin. Those are the big payoffs. And something Walking Ballista as well. You can see that in those lists. They just try to ramp with, they ramp with creatures, they ramp with spells to put lands into play. That's the deal. Try to race them if you can. I think racing is your best chance and to potentially win. And if you don't race them quickly enough, if they stall the board with their creatures on the battlefield and chump block and then slam an Ugin or an Ulamog, then I guess you're completely dead. But that is one of the biggest decks that you have to try to beat in Pioneer. Moving into number 4 is Green Devotion. So Green Devotion, or like some sort of green aggro deck, Elvish Mystic and Llanowar Elves. Some people say that these cards are busted, and there are variations of these sort of decks, but basically you'll start off with Elvish Mystic or Llanowar Elves. You can ramp into a Steel Leaf Champion, or you can play many Burning Tree Emissaries, but then they take advantage of Nykthos, add a bunch of mana, put some big creatures in play. I've seen versions with Ghalta. Definitely expect something like Walking Ballista in these decks. They're very strong. They're very, very strong. Do not underestimate them. They are definitely one of the decks to beat if you do not interact with their mana dorks. the game, you got to ask yourself who's going to goldfish better. So you have to interact with their little creatures, and if you don't, they could just completely overpower you. Moving into number 3, Blue-White Control. If they finally, after they ban Oko Thief of Crowns, after they ban Veil of Summer, Blue-White Control is finally playable. You just have to ban enough cards and also keep dig through time in order to make this deck a real deck. And so yeah, Blue-White Control, very serious. They got to keep a lot of really good cards. They've got the small Teferi, they got small Teferi, they got big Teferi, they've got dig through time, they've got a lot of really useful cards between Detention Sphere, Blessed Alliance, of course they have Supreme Verdict. So any creature deck, and most decks in Pioneer are creature-based decks. Supreme Verdict is basically the best answer, and the format's not so fast that you can, maybe some decks can do it, but the format's not so fast that you can get underneath the Supreme Verdict, so it's going to be wiping out something, and you got to make sure you just can go over the top, or you keep the gas coming to beat through that Supreme Verdict. But the point is, Blue-White Control has all the answers. They've got really good lands that can either put creatures onto the battlefield, like these 1/1 human creatures to chump block, buy time, or technically it could be a win condition, or they use Castle Ventress to keep finding the good stuff. Anyway, Blue-White Control, definitely one of the decks you have to beat in Pioneer. Moving to number 2, and this is like, it's like 2 decks in one sort of thing, but basically red deck wins. So there are basically 2 versions of this deck right now. I think what was really popular in the earlier stages of Pioneer was the burn-like decks with the Lava Runner and Eidolon of the Great Revel, and a lot of burn spells using Wizard's Lightning and Skullcrack and Skewer the Critics and all this stuff. So that deck still exists, but it's losing popularity in favor of the red deck wins sort of deck, the going big deck that's going like Chain Whirler into Talrand, into Chandra, into Glorybringer. Like, this deck goes big. They play Kari Zev, and they're playing with pretty good early game interaction in terms of like Wild Slash and Stomp, and like they slow the opponent down in the early stages of the game and then try to completely take over in the later stages of the game with just really big creatures. They're more creature dense than spell dense, and that's the difference between this red deck wins deck and the sort of burn-like deck. But there's a lot of similarities between the two. Like, the burn-like deck can still play Goblin Chain Whirler. They share a lot of cards, so things get blurred. But I would say that there's still sort of 2 different archetypes. But for the sake of this top 10, you better be prepared for both of them. So, with that, what is number 1? What is the number 1 deck you have to be prepared for in Pioneer, and that is Mono Black Aggro. So this deck is just loaded with 2/1 creatures for 1 mana that can come back from the graveyard one way or another. This deck is very aggressive. It gets to utilize Thoughtseize, it gets to utilize Fatal Push, and a lot of other creature removal spells like Grasp of Darkness, which basically kills anything in the format except for maybe some 5/5 creatures, but basically it will kill everything else. Very, very strong build. Many people on Twitter are bragging about going completely undefeated or just losing 1 match after like 19 matches. It's making top 8. It's a very strong deck. Because like very early on in the game, they can have like 6-8 power on the battlefield and then be attacking for wild amounts of damage by turns 2 to 4, while still backing it up with removal and also slowing you down with Thoughtseize. Turn 1, 2/1 creature, another few 2/1 creature, or 2/1 creature. They play a 1-drop, they play a 1-drop on turn 2, follow it up with Thoughtseize, slow you down a little bit, and then just spew out more creatures. Not to mention, they've got a top end themselves. They do play with things like Kalidas, so they can gain life. They also play with the Swift End creature, so kill a creature. A lot of good value. Really hard to grind out. Like, if you want to beat this deck, you gotta beat them. You gotta beat them. They gotta tempo them out. You gotta go way over the top of them somehow because their creatures keep coming back from the graveyard. Like the majority of their 2/1s for 1 mana have some clause. If your opponent lost life, bring this thing back from the graveyard. If you attack with a creature this turn, you can bring this card from the graveyard. So they've got the long game. So you better have to be able to beat them somewhere in between while they're attritioning you out and tempoing you out with their removal spells. Tough deck to beat. You better have a plan for it. Mono black aggro. So that's it. That's my top 8. That's my top 10 list of Pioneer decks that you have to be prepared for. Pioneer's a big format. It's going to get bigger. Really interesting interactive format. I'm loving it. And before you know it, Mono Blue Wizards is going to be #1 on this list. I just have to prove it to the world. So anyway, this has been Nikachu, Merfolk Master, preparing you all for Pioneer.